Okay, it's the top of the hour. We know folks will probably be coming in the next few minutes, but we'll go ahead and get started to be sensitive to everyone's time. So I'll turn it over to our moderator, Mason.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Yes, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mason Liddell, and I'm going to be monitoring this seminar at sort of a high level purpose. If you haven't been to one of these before, or maybe you just didn't do a bunch of the reading, the point of this seminar is to focus on putting together an Animal Law 101 type course, and this is part of a longer series hosted by George Washington Law's Council for Animal Legal Education. So with this focus more narrowly on an Animal Law 101 type course, we're looking at what sort of substance you want to focus on, the sequence when you want to hit different topics and at what time, basic classroom policies, and whatever other sorts of information might be useful if you are building a class like that from the ground up. So let's get into introductions and then we'll get into the substance. Like I said, I am Mason Liddell. I am the co-founder of Animal Council, which is a Colorado nonprofit focusing on policy work, academic writing, and I'm also a recent graduate of the University of Colorado Law School. While I was at Colorado Law, I played a very big role in getting the school to restart its class on wildlife law and offer for the first time a class on animal welfare. And right now, I am working with the school and one of our adjunct professors to design the next animal law course, which is going to have a heavier focus on practical legal work. Next up is Priscilla Rader Culp, who is the senior law school programs attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she manages student and law school opportunities and provides them resources, provides them support. I can personally attest to that. And as a part of that role, she works very closely with adjunct law professors at all sorts of different schools, with the people that are looking to teach animal law specifically and maybe grow their school's animal law communities. And in fact, she just herself wrapped up a semester co-teaching advanced animal law at, I believe, Lewis and Clark. Next up, we have Ashley Monty, who serves as counsel at the PETA Foundation. And there she works really closely with the other attorneys to provide advice, provide assistance on the wide range of legal issues that come out of PETA's work to protect animals. She got her JD and a Master of Food and Agriculture Law and Policy from Vermont Law and Graduate School, where she is also an adjunct professor teaching animal law. And last but not least, we've got Will Lowry, who is the founder and legal counsel for Animal Partisan, which is a legal advocacy organization that focuses on challenging illegal conduct in animal agriculture and animal experimentation. In his current role, or before his current role, Will worked for another animal protection nonprofit, and he sort of divided his time there between civil litigation and providing counsel for undercover investigators. Right now, Will is teaching animal law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, but before that, he has taught at a decent number of other schools. And with those introductions out of the way, let us get into the substance. Priscilla, the first one's going to be for you. So, from a very basic level, just ground up, when you are creating your Animal Law 101 syllabus, what format does it look like? What is it supposed to appear as?
Great starting question because, where do you start? And thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you to my co-panelists and Mason for moderating. I do want to flag that I am feeling a little under weather, so my throat is a little cracky. So I might not have the most elaborate answers, but I am going to pop in my email. And if you do want to, continue this conversation, through email or in a one-on-one meeting, I'm always happy to chat. I'm going to do my best to power through this. So yeah, great question. And there's no right or wrong answers here. This really is about finding your own voice as a professor and how your style goes. So all I can say is what I often see, but this is not the end all be all of syllabus creation by any means. So often when I work with adjunct professors, especially those first teaching, I often ask them what experiences as a student did worked and didn't for their learning styles, for their objectives in their own classes. And oftentimes what that is growing on foundational knowledge. So using a stacking method. And with that, a lot of the students who will be taking your animal law course probably also, are pretty unfamiliar with animal law, but they have that 1L foundational course in their toolkit. So I often suggest to use that as a starting point, at least to build on what they're already familiar with and how they can kind of conceptualize animal law as it fits into what they already know. So a lot of times you'll see that first week or first 2 weeks on, animals' legal status, the jurisprudence of animal law, and higher, like bigger legal theories behind animal law, why it matters, what it means. You also see a lot with standing, getting into more of how animal law functions as an area of law and how it behaves in the system, either for criminal or civil. From there, oftentimes I either see it split. Some professors really like to stick with that foundational stacking of, okay, now we're going to go into constitutional law and we're going to go through a lot of the key elements of animal law that pertains to constitutional law. So looking at ag, freedom of speech. And then they'll get into, environmental, criminal. And so they use that. I also see on the flip side, sometimes professors will kind of stick to animal specialty areas and cover laws under that. So what I mean by that is, getting into companion animal law and looking at consumer protection, criminal law, for anti-cruelty statutes, and everything else under companions, going into wildlife, going into industrial farming practices. So again, there's no right or wrong, but I do encourage professors, especially those just starting out, to really consider what worked and what didn't for them as a student. And then also take in what kind of assume that most students aren't going to know about animal law. So how can you really build up their knowledge and understanding? And then later on, I'll see professors get into the weeds, and that's when they're really getting into maybe more philosophical approaches or what's emerging in animal law, or really diving deep into a particular area of interest, say, going back to ag and really like looking at those cases closely and walking through it. So it's not to say that you have to stick to the foundational throughout the course design, but at least those few weeks, I think that's most helpful. All right, I'm gonna see if other panelists have anything to add with that one.
I was just going to add in at a really tactical level from a format perspective, and I think this is true of many areas of law, right? If you don't know what the format is or what it should look like, find some examples and make yours look like that. There's no shortage of syllabi out there. I think ALDF has maybe a repository, George Washington might. And so, it's the same thing. Like if I'm going to court in a random state and you don't know what it looks like, just Google, find a PDF of what it is. They don't teach you that in law school. I think the same concept applies here. Find somebody else's syllabus, see what it looks like. I do think would also say though, and we'll talk about policies later, certainly check with the school, right? Because they may have a format or certain topics to cover. But from a very basic perspective, I remember when I was first teaching, it was like, where do I start? I've got a blank Word document. Like go find somebody else's and start with that. It's better than recreating the wheel.
Yeah, thank you, Will. We do have a repository with sample syllabi, exams, all of that. So if you email me, I popped my email in the chat, but for those unable to view the chat, or for e-readers, my email is prader, R-A-D as in dog, E-R @aldf.org. And we can get you access to that. I'm very much into not reinventing the wheel when you don't need to. And yeah, great point.
Touching briefly on that point that Will brought up at the end, that sometimes, I mean, maybe understandably, schools are going to have requirements that they expect of you. I guess we can start with Will on this question, but obviously everybody is welcome to chime in. How do you know what the school is looking for? What sorts of issues have you come into when professors or deans are reviewing your syllabus that you've submitted to them?
Yeah, I think a lot, at least in my experience, so I've taught now at three different law schools and they're all kind of different and it sort of just depends on the school. It depends on how they view adjuncts, like how closely they sort of manage you or let you do your own thing. And so I think the best bet, as with lots of different things, is to find a contact. Like who is the person at the school that can answer your questions? I remember when I first started, I was so scared of doing something wrong, and I asked so many obnoxious questions about what do I do here, and you find that person who's like really patient and doesn't mind answering those, and ask that person, what does the school have a template? Are there certain things that I should include or not include? I think there are some questions that may, I would say, go beyond the logistical questions, like is there a template, and they may get more into the is it appropriate for me to cover this, right? Or like should I warn the students about those things? You probably need somebody more in a leadership perspective or position. But I guess I would say in general with a lot of things, before you spend a lot of time and dive too deep creating your syllabus and your content and getting all excited, like I always try to figure out what are the guardrails, what are the school's guardrails that are going to control me. And I think the only way you can get that is to ask somebody, or many schools will have an adjunct handbook, right? And sometimes they're 50 pages, 100 pages. Like you're kind of obligated to look through that, right? And so ask somebody, look through the handbook and kind of set out your requirements and then try to fill in the gaps with questions. But I would definitely recommend doing that before you get too far.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Like if there are resources out there, if you can reach out to somebody, if somebody like Priscilla has a repository, if the school has handbooks, those are all really useful. I mean, I can, speaking for myself, I guess, I stitched together the first draft of the syllabus that I was working on just after emailing a bunch of people who I knew taught animal law courses similar enough to the one that I wanted and looking at the things that they offered. Like you will get a lot of resources. People really want to help. They want to put on events like this, and I think that that's all really valuable.
Yeah. And just to add, I love finding a buddy at the law school is a great, and they don't need to be an animal law buddy, just someone, in admin, someone out there who knows what's up and can has that patience and personability to kind of walk you through those things. Um, to add to all of that, I know that the ABA is also a big elephant in the room for syllabus creation. And so I strongly recommend, just reviewing, especially for, programmatic work within like classroom and learning outcome settings, and curriculum mapping and all of that. To read the ABA rules, especially because I believe that they changed earlier this year and there's been revisions, additions, changes to learning outcomes. And so looking at that, and then also, one way that we've been successful in getting an animal law course at a particular school was that they had somewhat lower bar passage rates, and so their focus was really on bar topics. And so the professor was able to design a syllabus that sort of incorporated a lot of the bar topics, but animal themed bar topics. So that was a really good way of working with the administrative needs while still trying to and successfully getting that animal law class. But yeah, echo to what Will said for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if we're getting into the sort of substance that your class might want to take on here, Ashley, maybe I'll toss this one to you. Is there anything that you feel like is basically necessary, right? If you are doing Animal Law 101, what do you have to talk about?
Oh goodness. I feel okay. So, just for a little context for everyone who's watching, I just taught my first animal law course this past summer online, asynchronous. I actually inherited Will's course, which I'm so grateful for. Because again, why start from scratch if you don't have to, or reinvent the wheel, as we say. And to me, as someone who also practices animal law, like everything is essential. So it was really, really hard to pin down like what do I really think is super important. And thinking back to when I was a student who is really getting into animal law, like what did I think was fundamental? And I think Priscilla mentioned this earlier, but a lot of animal law courses begin with the history of animal law, and I think it's a pretty peculiar and interesting history to learn about. And then covering the philosophers and thinkers who discuss like different um, just ways of thinking about animals and their status in society and under the law. And so I do think that that is important to start with because it really helps us sort of center ourselves in the world that we're going to be diving into for this semester or however long your course is. Other than that, I really think there's so much freedom to how you want to structure the class and what you might consider as essential. For me, I thought, you have to touch on all of the big ticket federal laws that address animals, whether that's the Animal Welfare Act, the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammals Protection Act, all of those different types of laws. And then, exploring to what extent you want to cover state laws, whether that's just really focusing in on the criminal aspect with, cruelty statutes, or if you want to go beyond that. Anyways, I could ramble on. There's so much flexibility, but I would definitely say starting with the fundamentals of like the history of animals and the law, philosophers, thinkers, sort of the status of animals under the law, and then, of course, ticking off the big ticket items when it comes to actual federal laws that address animals.
If I can add something, and I'm pretty sure I made this plug on another webinar, but I won't pass up the opportunity to do it here. I feel like every animal law class should do a deep dive into farmed animal issues just because that's the greatest number of animals suffering. And I also feel like it resonates. Like everybody is eating food, everybody is dealing with that, and there's no shortage of law. So maybe from an advocacy perspective, like I think it would behoove us as a movement to spend a good bit of time on that topic.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Priscilla, you go away. Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess save your throat a little bit if it's gonna get that scratched up. Will, I did want to talk about the inverse of that a little bit though, because right as we know, animal law can get a little bit dicey, it can get a little bit difficult, especially in the world of animal agriculture. How do you deal with sensitive topics? What kind of warnings might you give people? What might you put in the syllabus?
I mean, I think people are probably going to vary when it comes to this topic. I mean, I think at a minimum, you need to stop and think about it, right? Like, regardless of what path you go down, you shouldn't just go full steam ahead and go, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, right? I think the first step is to just think about, like, what are you going to present and how are you going to present it? I think at the end of the day, we want people to digest information, to learn information, and you need to have some consideration to what's the right way to give that to people. There's no shortage of studies out there about like graphic videos. Do they work? Do they not work? And there are different opinions and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's going to depend on the person, but I think two things are probably true regardless. One, you should give it some thought. Two, you should check with the school to see if there are policies. I think especially as like a new professor, the last thing you want to do is, put up some slaughterhouse video on a 15-foot screen and have everybody leave you poor reviews, and then the class never repeats again. So there's some like practical sense to it. From my perspective, and again, this is just my view, I don't show blood and guts and gore because I think people are going to turn away, but I also don't shy away from the stuff that I can show. So I have, videos of a slaughterhouse. There's no animals being slaughtered, but I want people to see the process and to see the shackles and the belts and the captive bolt gun and that sort of stuff. And I also don't shy away from anything verbally. Like I will describe situations verbally, give people stuff to read verbally. That's pretty harsh and pretty graphic. That's my personal opinion. I've not gotten negative feedback. So I don't think I have the answer other than think about it, ask the school, and then do what you're comfortable with and what you think will be most effective for your students.
Yeah, to add on that, I agree that I believe that like students have an expectation to know that there will be some upsetting content just by the very nature of what we're discussing. So I agree with Will that, think about it, figure out what your own advocacy looks like and where you sort of fit in on whether it's effective or not. And there is really different answers for different folks. And, some students, I think, during undergrad, for example, when I was first seeing those footages, I had some students who watched every second, like, oh my gosh, and other students leave the classroom and just not engage. So it really does depend. But I think that there is a certain expectation. And so as long as you're not showing gratuitous violent content just for the sake of shock value or to try to get a rise out of people, if it's thoughtful, if it's relevant, then show it. Again, check with your school. You can always have something in your syllabus that includes like a graphic footage warning, just a blanket one. When I was putting together independent study materials for our student chapters that don't have an animal course, one of the things that I did flag for graphic content was if it was unrelated to animal cases. So, for instance, I had a domestic violence case that included an animal cruelty charge, but there was graphic depictions and verbal descriptions of the domestic violence. So that was sort of, not really expected necessarily, I think, by students. So we did flag that one for graphics. So I think, yeah, just thinking hard about it, thinking about your own advocacy and your own approach. Yeah.
If I can just jump in also really quick, teaching in the online world that's asynchronous, I think kind of has the benefit in that you can sort of preview the content that's coming for students. Like I did an intro video before they would begin the next module, and I would do exactly that. I would kind of preview and give warnings about the content they were about to consume that week, in addition to warnings related to what was Priscilla saying, like, oh, we were going to be covering some other, yeah, it might be domestic violence, it could be other types of issues. So I think that was really helpful for students. And I also did include a warning in my syllabus explaining that the class does cover content that is not only discusses like violence to animals, but also to humans, and just generally putting that sort of warning at the very beginning. Although I agree with what Will and Priscilla said in general. And I think to a certain extent, students do expect to encounter that type of content.
Yeah, I think that my most salient moment with this one comes from not an animal law course so much as just an undergrad ethics course. I loved this professor dearly, but he made some interesting decisions with things like this. And I think that at one point, right, we all walked into the classroom and without any sort of warning or awareness, there were just videos of chicks being slaughtered up on the screen, and he was just playing it and playing it and playing it. And that was not received very well. People did not like that. People didn't like walking into that without any sort of heads up. I think that the warning plays a really big role because people do expect this, right? These are sad and difficult topics very frequently, but I don't think anybody wants to be I don't know, surprised by that. You should give people at least something of a heads up. And I like the idea of putting it in a syllabus so that you just know what you're getting into from the start. But then I think repeating that before you do anything too graphic is also pretty valuable. I'd say moving on to lighter topics, but this one's about current events. Ashley, how do you incorporate current events, right? This is a hot field. How do you deal with that in your syllabus? Do you update it over the semester, anything like that?
Yes. So because again, am new to teaching animals and law, since I inherited Will's class, there had been updates in the law, especially related to like standing and, other things. So that was something I had to update. But as far as like other sort of, when I think of like current events, I think of like things that are really hot topics. I tried to think about how I can tie news articles into things that the students were working on. So, for example, there was a news article covering that there was a decision out of New York that was really positive when it comes to negligent intention. NIED. I don't know why. I feel like if I try to say it out loud right now, it's just not going to come out. Um, And so I was able to use the announcement feature to sort of tie that in because we had literally just covered intentional infliction of emotional distress and negligent infliction of emotional stress. I did it. So I like the announcements feature, but also if it's a current event or if like it's a big happening in the world that occurs before the course, you could think about including it as an assignment or as part of an assignment. So, the services proposed a rule to rescind the definition of harm under the Endangered Species Act. So I included as an assignment students writing a comment, and they had to adopt some sort of interest, whether it be like industry, an animal rights organization, some other, interest group. So that's another way you can think about it if you obviously have enough time to plan how to incorporate that into your course. But I do think it's important to include current events because it really ties everything back into present day and like how this all applies in real life. So there's so many ways. So I'm going to defer to Priscilla and Will, who have definitely been teaching animal law much longer than I have, but that's kind of how I did it this past year.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think current events in many cases can engage interest more. Like people watch the news, they see what's going on, like if they've seen a news article. And so, um, I don't remember a time talking about some happening and people not being interested or a little more enthused than usual because like it's out there in the news. And I do think it's a good exercise in demonstrating how pervasive animal law is. I mean, there's no shortage of things that you can see in the news that any of us could find an animal law angle to it, whether it's the farm bill or some policy or an administration change, whatever the case might be. I think it's sort of a good point to get to garner interest, and it's also a place to reinforce that animal law is everywhere. So I'm all for it, but at the same time, I guess I would also say um, this is just my opinion. You have to be careful not to sacrifice the rest of your content and sort of go on a current event stream, right? You've got a syllabus with very important stuff. You can easily get swept up in the news and talk about this, that, and the other. You have finite time in this class and certain topics to cover. So you just need to be careful about like how much time are you going to allocate to this? What is the expense of it? I remember when I was in law school, there was some big current events, and I remember the professor spending all class on it. And I sat there thinking about how many dollars of tuition I was wasting because I wasn't getting the education. And you don't want bitter people like me. So just sort of gauge like how much time you're spending on it, what's the value of it versus the content you're sacrificing.
Definitely. And to chime in, just to add, I think there's a lot of uncertainty too with what's coming out. And so it can sometimes be hard to teach. Changes might be made, but there's not really anything that's shown what happens with those changes or how they're actually going to play out or how they work. So I think that sticking with your syllabus can be helpful. And then, yeah, like Ashley said, incorporating it, finding ways for them to take action or be part of it, like the public commenting for the harm definition change is just brilliant. And I think that if you're able to do that while sticking with, the checklists that you really need to complete to give them a worthwhile education can be really great. One thing, if you have a small enough class, one thing that I liked as a student and I have done as a professor is, doing news, first 20 minutes of the class is just students bringing up news that they saw that interest them and then talking about that, bringing it back to maybe what you're discussing if you can. And then you have sort of a time cap on it. They know to expect. You can even have it as an assignment to where it's like, okay, Ashley, you're up for news this week. So you bring in an article and then you present on that for like, a couple minutes, you say what's it out, and then there's a discussion, right? And then that's participation or that's, some sort of engagement checkbox marked off as well. But yeah, I really love the idea of incorporating it as activities. That was really neat.
Yeah, I did one of those in I think the animal welfare seminar. We had a very similar structure of just like animal news of the week. So each week I think it was about 15 people and there were 14 weeks. So one person would just show up and fill the first 10, 15 minutes with something that's going on. And honestly, I think it really did a lot for like class congeniality. Like if you have a friendly enough attitude as the professor and you're sort of trying to make everybody gel, having people stand up and give these like informal talks, I think is really useful, right? If you have a small class, use that to your advantage. Get people to actually like being there rather than just being lectured at the whole time. I think that's really important. But I am noticing one, I don't know, theme throughout all of your answers, which is that there's a lot, right? There's a lot of animal law things that are happening. There's a lot of animal law things that have happened. So I guess we can start with Priscilla on this one. But how do you begin picking and choosing amongst all of these options? How do you even start to do that?
Yeah, great question. I would say go back to that wheel we talked about and see what other people, textbooks, articles. Conley just in the chat put in a YouTube video that is really helpful to show conditions of CAFOs without it being too graphic. So, have a folder on your computer of just everything you put in as you find it, and then really figure out, how many pages of reading is this? How relevant is it? How does it fit into the rest of the structure? Um, but in thinking about like materials and what to include, I yeah, just ask around, gather up, and then figure out what fits and doesn't. We I was co-teaching, we had a lot of things we wanted to fit, and so we at first we had like required all of this, it's so interesting, you'll love it. And then I sat with that a while and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of reading, maybe we should pull some of these optional. So also make considerations for that, and how many credits your class is and all of that relevant stuff. But just crowdsource as much as you can. You can put in Google alerts for certain issues or topics and have those come up. Sit in, if you're able to, if there's like another law school in your area. I really recommend like seeing if you can sit in on one or build that network. But yeah, I would definitely be gathering. And there are just like Ashley mentioned the history of animal law, and there's like a really amazing article that was written a long time ago by Joyce Tischler. And, I still share that with students because it includes so much history. So there are key things that I think a lot of syllabuses include, but like, there's so much. So, yeah.
I would go ahead, Ashley.
Mine comment is quick, and I don't know like if this is just because my this is how my brain works, but another way that I determined like what content and how much to include is to think about my assessments and like what information am I expecting that they know, and then what like assigned content do I have that actually provides them that information? So sort of like checking the box, like, oh, okay, I want them to be able to answer this short answer question. These two readings provide them with that information, and sort of reverse engineering like what I want them to know and sort of doing it that way. And then those are the required readings, and then I can kind of fill in some other fun stuff or interesting things as sort of supplemental.
I was just going to say, I think one thing to keep in mind is like what areas are you comfortable with and not comfortable with? I mean, you have to be credible when teaching it. And I say this as like there's lots of areas like MMPA, ESA that I'm not comfortable. Like I do it and I cover it in a very cursory fashion, but I think it's worthwhile to put some lens on it to say, how comfortable are you with this information? Because if you're comfortable, you're going to convey it better, they're going to learn more. So that's one. And then completely unrelated, and this is something that I learned. I would like don't overlook the body of law related to animal rights activism, whether it's protest or open rescue or ag gag or First Amendment. I did that in my first class, and then it dawned on me. I was like, gosh, this is such a rich area of law, and it's really interesting, and there's lots of current events. So again, just another plug to consider that as an area of law to cover.
Yeah, on the topic of sort of comfort and familiarity with it, I mean, it's sort of just like the logical consequence of something Priscilla said earlier, right? Animal law is pretty broad, it's pretty encompassing, but the flip side of that is no one person is just sort of the expert on animal law because it just touches on all these different little subfields that it's unrealistic to expect one person to have completely mastered the craft. So I do think that that's part of why approaching your Animal Law 101 course as truly a 101 course is important. And then, I don't know, maybe a little plug for what I did, but like wildlife law. CU loves wildlife. That was number one. Whenever I talked to people at that school, they always wanted to talk about wildlife over any other animal issue. And I felt like, okay, if this is what the people want, then this is what will sell the most easily. And this is what's going to bring in more people and help me advocate for more animal law classes here. So we focused hugely on like the Colorado analog to the Endangered Species Act. We focused hugely on the Endangered Species Act, Lacey Act, like all of the specialty wildlife things. And I think that it worked great. And I know that it helped funnel people into our more general animal welfare seminar too. So these things can kind of pick up synergies like that. Also, I apologize for using the word synergies. um, so related well enough, right? If this is how you pick and choose what goes in there, I have at least struggled to pick and choose how to order that and how to structure that, right? Because you can pick it around, maybe it's wildlife, maybe it's animal agriculture, but maybe if we're talking about history, you're doing 1800s to 1900s, or maybe you're talking about what specific industry is at play or the species. There's a lot of different ways that you can order these things. So I guess let's start with Will. How would you recommend grouping and how would you recommend, I don't know, the sequencing of those subjects?
Yeah, I certainly don't have the answer. I mean, I guess I would start with something that I think Priscilla mentioned earlier. I think you should be cognizant of like the foundational things that need to go first. Like you can't just randomly jump into the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and people have no idea what you're talking about, like how animals are under the law. And so I think starting with some of the foundational aspects, I mean, I start with things like what is animal law? What is animal welfare versus animal rights? Like, how are animals viewed under the law? These sort of basic things. And then I think you can build from there. And then I move to things that I think are pretty easily digestible, like cruelty laws and neglect laws, before you start jumping into some of the further afield things. Once you get past that, though, like I don't know, it's like a Rubik's cube. You could probably twist it a million different ways and put this here and this here and this here. I think you just, for me, it's like you have a formula. Like, what are the foundational blocks you need to start with? What are you most comfortable teaching? And then what sequence makes sense? Does some things flow from the other, right? Are you going to go from farmed animal stuff to ag stuff? Like maybe that makes sense. Maybe you've got a section on ESA and MMPA, and that's sort of in these like, a similar like wildlife section. So I don't have a great answer other than that. I just be very thoughtful of it. I think the worst thing you want to do is just make a very disjointed syllabus where people are jumping from one topic to the next. It doesn't make sense. There's like theories and doctrines that don't correlate or they don't compute. You've missed opportunities to connect the dots. That's probably the best I can say.
I'd like to just echo Will really quick. And then the one thing I'll add is that I like to think about what do I want my last module to be because this is the end of the course. Students are going to be studying for the final exam soon. I don't want the last module to be something, honestly, that's super critical because I just feel like that's, especially when you're doing a 7-week condensed course over the summer term, like that's not ideal. So as far as like sequencing, I just made sure that my last module was something a little bit more fun, if you will. So I did address standing and like high impact litigation and talked about like PETA's right to hear case and just like some fun, unique things that have been brought to keep it a little light on the content. And a lot of it is things that they already have learned. And it's just yeah. So as far as sequencing, like I also think, consider what you want your last module to be because students by then might be a little burnt out. They might be like stressed about finals.
Go ahead, Priscilla.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, sometimes, working backwards, especially if you get stuck, figuring out the last module and then what do they need for that and going up and through really works. One quick thing I would flag that I should have mentioned earlier is, like guest speakers. That's a thing. If you're not the most comfortable talking about a particular topic, but it needs to be covered, and you have content to share, all that, you can always invite a guest speaker too. It could be another faculty at the law school who covers that area, or you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to find someone to come chat with you, or your network. But I think relying on others' expertise too can be really solid and give students different perspectives, different backgrounds, and different voices to learn from.
Really sorry. I'm going to echo that again. I'm going to echo again, just because I actually did interview like 4 or 5 individuals for my course because for that exact reason, just recognizing I don't have practice experience in all of the areas of law, animal law. And in my course evaluations, that was something that students really appreciated, was just getting to hear from practitioners who were like doing work related to vivisection or doing farmed animal things. So yes, I think that's a great idea.
I was just gonna kind of plus one to Ashley's idea about thinking of the last module for a couple reasons that I've run into. One is that if you run out of time and the other stuff takes longer, like whatever is last, you're going to have to cut, presumably. And then the other part of that is that ideally you have your exam written or your final paper written before then. And so you want to make sure that you get to the content that's in your exam, right? You don't want to exam and I've got 5 multiple choice questions about the very last module and then I don't get to it or I have to rush through it and now I've got to go back and change my exam. So I think those are some tactical considerations as well.
Great point. And I will just tack on that, if you really think like, okay, we're going to try our best to get to this last module, but I'm really not sure if we're going to make it, cough, cough, what we went through during our last class, because there was so much content. Um, 2 things come up is either a review. So having, depending on, the students, but we did a review. So they emailed us all of the things that, they're kind of still questioning or aren't sure about and stuff. So then we just kind of created that last module to be review and to maybe dig into topics that we didn't have time earlier a little bit better. Or another thing that I've seen, and again, this would kind of depend on students and everything, but doing some sort of like career panel for that end session, bringing in practitioners who work in different areas. So having a litigator, maybe someone in legislation, policy, regulation, wherever it might be, having them come in and just talk about, how to take everything you learned and implement into that post-grad or, career advice for how to turn this into a pathway. So maybe, less substantive, but still really engaging and helpful for students.
A couple of folks brought up guest speakers, and first off, I like guest speakers. I think guest speakers are funner, and then like another good way to sort of shake things up. But it does touch on another question that I wanted to make sure we asked, which is how do you pick the ways to convey information, right? So when I'm asking this question, I'm not saying like, okay, great. Like, what materials do you cover? I mean, are we talking essays? Are we talking books? Are we talking textbooks? Are we talking videos? Because you can get a lot of information through a lot of different ways. So I guess we can start with Ashley on this one. Was there intentionality behind like the specific media that you picked, or was it just this is the content I want to talk about, therefore I will pick it?
Yes, I definitely thought about the media that I wanted to assign, especially because again, my course was online, asynchronous, 7 week, condensed. These students are going to be in it 18 to 20 hours per week is what they're supposed to spend on the course. So I didn't want them just glued to their computer screens reading online or reading if they bought the textbook, the physical version, doing that. So I was intentional about trying to assign videos, podcasts, um, definitely articles, but didn't always try to just make it like a law review article. Again, trying to make it a little bit more fun, um, and more digestible. Of course, there is reading from like law review articles in the textbook, and that can be a little dense. But yeah, I definitely tried to mix it up and include a variety of things. And I actually when I broke down each module, I wrote down like how many pages of reading, how many hours of listening to something. And I really tried to make it so that it wasn't too much of one or the other, that it was pretty balanced. And when I did my intro for each module, I kind of told the students whether or not they could like review things out of order in which I had it listed. So if they're having a day where they're like, "Oh, I really don't want to read. But I could listen to a podcast," then they know like, "Oh, it doesn't matter when they listen to that podcast. They can do that at any point in time." So trying to also make it flexible, so that they can really base it on what they have in them to do, if that makes sense, because I know it can be a lot. So yes.
Yeah, I would also like to double down on the podcast aspect too. I mean, maybe I'm just biased because I really like podcasts, but I do think that there's a lot of value in flexibility, and there's a lot of value in recognizing that your students probably want some amount of flexibility too. Like I think that law school just has a tendency to be a bit of a slog, and everybody knows that it's a bit of a slog, but I mean, animal law is modern, right? There's a lot of interesting things going on. We are not limited to like dusty opinions from the Supreme Court in the 1800s. You can pick interesting modern things that are happening right now, like we were talking about earlier. And I feel like, if you have the capacity and if you can fit that in a way that feels natural, you should feel free to explore those different media too. That makes sense to me.
I,
Oh yeah,
can I
Priscilla.
just Sorry, I was just going to add, I agree. I think variability or variety is good, but I guess just one other sort of type of material is like actual court filings. I think there's a lot of value in those. I remember when I went to law school, I don't think I saw an actual court filing like the whole time I was in law school. And so have people read a complaint, a motion, that sort of stuff. I think it just can bring the real world home a little bit. And it's a change of pace.
Definitely on that. I was like, oh wow, am I allowed to see these? Like when I started seeing them because they were just so foreign to me. Um, uh, Another thing I just wanted to mention, because it's animal law fundamentals, I do think that textbooks are quite helpful. But I do know that some professors, will forego textbooks for a lot of different reasons. So I would just consider, you know, if you do decide to use a textbook, there are many great ones out there. I mean, you have the animal law cases and materials textbook that really walks through everything we're pretty much talking about. And if you find that you will utilize that textbook a lot, then by all means assign it. But I do just say, like, keep in mind that these are expensive for students. So if you have a textbook assigned, but you go through your syllabus and you're not really using the textbook for all it's worth, maybe consider whether you can look at some free alternatives or get publisher permission for piecemealing, excerpts or whatever you might need, just to be considerate of the time and money. But I do think that textbooks are quite helpful, especially for foundational courses, especially when you're first starting to teach.
All right, probably last question from me, if we can keep this one maybe on the shorter side, just to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. Let's start with Will on this one. When you are structuring your class, right? I assume, adding assessments. How do you pick which assessments you want to use? There's a lot of options, right? Multiple choice, regular short answers, long essay, no test, whatever it is. How do you pick amongst those?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I like for me, I go back to those guardrails, and some of it is how many students do I have? Like, what can I reasonably grade? I mean, if I've got 30 students, like sometimes I've had my Oklahoma class, do I want to grade, 10-page papers from each of them? Like mechanically, that's probably pretty hard to do. So I think it's to some extent a factor of like how much time and ability do you have. Um, I think what does the content lend itself to? I mean, there are some parts of animal law that are very binary. It's a multiple choice. You can fit this in here, you can fit this in here. I think you have to think about what you want the students to learn and take away. Do you just want them to know black and white knowledge and that's fine? Or do you really want to sort of engage their critical thinking and make them problem solve? So those are some of the things that I think about. I mean, I've kind of settled on like a mix of multiple choice and bar exam type essay questions. That works for me. That's not to say it works for everybody. I mean, I know other people have papers. I think for me, I somewhat stay away from papers. I stay away from things that I feel like can be too subjective. My greatest fear is like, being subjective and not being balanced and fair, and somebody being like, oh my gosh, you gave this person this. Like, I want to have a rubric and something that I can point to and say, look, there is kind of a right and wrong answer to this. It's not just write a paper, this one's better than yours. So I guess my best answer would be, think about what you have the capacity to answer, and then think about what you want the students to learn, and then what you're comfortable with.
I'll add that if you happen to be teaching in the online environment where you tend to have like you do a post and then you have people comment. I remember when I was a student, I just found that incredibly, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say boring, but I was not a fan. I did try my best to engage, but sometimes I just found it really uninteresting. I don't know. So when I was teaching, I really tried to make sure that each post assignment was totally different from the last as far as like what the ask was. So for example, I already mentioned that I had one where students had to write a comment. I had another where students had to go find an inspection report that had a direct or a critical violation, summarize it, and then tell me what it means or what their thoughts are and whether they agreed with the designation as critical and whatnot. So really trying to vary it so that students aren't just kind of doing the same thing every week. But otherwise, I totally agree with everything that Will said.
All right. Well, thank you all for your answers so far. I feel like now would be probably a pretty good time to open it to the floor if folks have questions that they want to ask any of us. Feel free to just raise your hand in person if your camera's on, or you can just use the little icon, and hopefully that will pop up if everything's working correctly.
I'm just looking at Julie's question, which I think is a really good one. So I've gotten through the first part of it, but um, I mean, part of it is going to depend on how many credits is your class, how many hours are the students expected to work. But to the part of, do you read through everything yourself? Yeah, absolutely. Like there's many a times where I'm preparing for class and I'm like, gosh, I feel like I'm in law school again. I thought this was the easy part, but now I feel like I'm a student because I have to go back and reread this 25-page case again. I think if you don't do that, you're going to lose credibility. I mean, students, there are going to be students that read it in detail and they're going to ask you questions that you don't know. So I would absolutely say, like, you need to be on point. Like, honestly, I feel like there's a degree of pressure with that. You need to be able to answer all the questions, be able to steer the conversation. And I don't think you can do that unless you're very well versed in the material. But as to the other part, how much to give, I think it just depends on, how long is your class, how much time are the students expected to commit. That would be my answer.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I made sure that I read all the materials when I was like determining the syllabus. And like I had mentioned earlier, I actually calculated, well, how many pages, how many hours of material do they have to listen to something? And how many hours do I think this is going to take them to get through? Because if they have to ideally do 18 to 20 hours per week, well, that's not 18 to 20 hours of necessarily reading and watching things. They have to study. There's other, respond to the assessment. So it was really like a calculation of, do I think this is reasonable? And then when the class started, I was a week ahead of them and I was re-consuming the materials because I just wanted to make sure, as Will said, that I am just as versed and ready to go with questions, especially if there are detailed questions. So yeah,
Thanks. That makes sense. That's basically what I was planning to do because I'm just getting ready to start putting something together. So thanks.
One other thing that I think is maybe just a good flag from throughout this conversation, but I think it's important to sort of check your own knowledge and try genuinely to put yourself in the shoes of a student, right? Like you might be sitting there thinking like, oh, well, animal standing is not that difficult, right? It's basically just standing, and then you add this twist of animal. But like if you just learned what standing is maybe 3 months ago, that's going to be a lot harder, right? Like you have to climb both of those hills. So truly trying to put yourself in the perspective of somebody who does not know what you are talking about. Don't treat people like they have no idea. Like, treat them like they're intelligent, but don't just presume a certain amount of information. And it took you, whatever it is, took you 1 hour to do this reading, so it'll take them 1 hour. No, like they might have to teach themselves some of these basic concepts from start. All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Well, I was just going to add real quick to what you said, Mason. I think a perfect example of what you just said is admin law. I think that's one where if you've been practicing for a while, you're like, yeah, everybody knows exhaustion of remedies, rulemaking petition. But then if you get students that have no idea, like you're blowing through it and you've completely lost them. So, and that's such a relevant area of animal law. So I totally agree with what you said. I think admin law is a particularly dangerous area to maybe gauge where people are before you dive into the deep.
Actually, I have another question. I mean, this isn't really totally relevant to what I'm doing, but it is in a way. I'm just for background, I'm putting together a very general animal law course for people basically outside the US, not even, for people here. It's more sort of for everyone, a very general thing that could be for almost any country. And I was just curious, when do students here in the US typically take animal law? Like when does it sort of insert? What do they already know? What courses haven't they taken? But what is most typical for students in a law program?
My guess is Priscilla, maybe you or Kathy might have the best answers to this.
I can jump in if you want, Priscilla, and then yeah. So Julie, the because of the way legal education works in the U.S., the first year is prescribed, so they can't take it first year, and so that means it's either a second or third year elective course. And what I've seen is anywhere from first semester, second year, to last semester, third year. And so it sort of does depend if a school has more than one animal law offering. They'll try to have the foundations or the fundamental course, in the second year for sure, and sometimes in the fall so that the spring option can follow it. But it's really all over the place when students choose to take it, because if they're just taking one course, it doesn't necessarily matter to them where it fits in the flow. And so to your point, they might not have had, well, if they take it first semester, second year, they won't have had admin or professional responsibility or evidence or some of these other courses. And so to Mason's point, you are teaching them those fundamental areas of law as well as the animal overlay. And so it changes, but you're going to have students in the class who have had some of those courses, right? So you're going to be teaching to a really diverse mix, no matter when it's offered, because the students are selecting in at different times.
Actually, that makes me feel better because the work I've been doing, we had students that were in their third year or third semester or fourth semester of a 5-year BA LLB program. And so actually it's perfect with what you just said.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that at least the programs that I'm aware of in the UK and Europe, less so in Asia, that tends to be where, because it's like an undergraduate program for lawyers, right? Not college and then law school. And so they do tend to offer those after the first couple of years when some of the basics, they've done the basic college and a little bit of the basic law stuff. And then they begin to offer it sort of a little, like 2/3 of the way through or more. So it seems like your instinct is good, and I think it fits well with some of the international programs that I've seen.
Okay, thank you.
I can jump in really quickly on the question Mariah just asked in the chat. and then maybe we can wrap it up unless one of y'all has something you'd like to add. Yeah, Mariah, I think that we talked a little bit about this earlier, but yeah, student presentations I think are really useful, right? Like in my animal welfare seminar, we did animal news of the week where you would just stand up and give like a 10-minute talk about a thing that has happened in the last week. But I really think sort of broadening it out a little bit, it's just important to do things to get students involved, right? Like I'm a bit of a weird person, so I actually like being lectured at, but I recognize that that is probably not the majority of people. I think that people want to be engaged and they want to feel engaged. So if you're able to make them feel welcome in this space by giving them the opportunity to do something, but making sure that they have the tools to actually do that well, I think that that goes a really long way towards building community in what will probably be a smaller class. Yes, yeah. All right, do any of y'all have anything to add, or shall we move on to this last stage? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you all. Oh, Will,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
no, I think Ken had his hand up. Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. I do have a quick question. We spoke of guardrails earlier, and I'm just kind of wondering if you're doing an animal law topic and it delves into stuff like international trade law with the animals or say veterinary medicine law, how far do you delve into those types of laws without, going too deep into one topic or another? I'm just wondering, is there any, structure there or just, touch on it, reflect on it, or actually go into it kind of thing? I'm just curious.
I can take a first hack at it just because I think given the scope of the seminar right now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Animal Law 101, you probably want to leave international trade alone, at least for the most part. But yeah, I don't know. Will, maybe do you have thoughts on how to incorporate these much more substantive things into a different course?
Ken, what was besides international trade? What was the other topic you suggested?
Veterinary medicine law.
Oh, yeah. I mean, international trade, I've never covered, and probably because it's too smart for me, so I wouldn't know what to say. But I agree with Mason. I think that's probably a little far afield. But I did cover vet malpractice, and I actually initially put it in as a small topic, and then I found there was a lot of discussion and a lot of interest there. And it's not that complicated. I mean, I say this as somebody who doesn't practice it, but it's something like you can spend some time on, and I feel like people can take some pretty foundational learnings from. It ties into their torts negligence learnings. And so I would say that one of the two feels like something that you could spend some time on. I definitely do probably spend an hour on that at least. I agree with Mason though on the international trade one, probably a little bit too much. So I think it's probably topic dependent, but for me it would be more of like how common is this topic? How frequent are people to encounter this? How relevant is it to the larger field of animal law? If all of those answers are pretty likely or pretty much, then it's probably worth considering spending time on it.
All right. Anybody else have something they want to add to Ken's question? Okay, cool. Well, in that case, this time for real, thank you all for being here. Truly, thank you all for being here. I've had a lot of fun doing this. And I would like to flag that in the near future, right? Keep an eye out for the next part of this series, October 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We're doing another seminar on in-class exercises. So I hope to see you all there.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.